Welcome to the Mike Litton Experience Podcast. Mike has over 31 years experience in real estate, finance, and investing. He's passionate about being a father, a teacher, a realtor, an investor, and a leader. Everyone has a story, and our passion is to help them tell it. And now, introducing the host of the Mike Litton Experience, Mike Litton.
So what can you expect from the Mike Litton Experience? You can expect stories that will inspire, motivate, advice that will sharpen your focus, and expert information on real estate, finance, and market conditions. Mark Doherty, thank you so much for being our guest on the Mike Litton Experience. I'm super excited about our time together. Like we talked about before we hit record, everybody has a story, and our passion is to help them tell it. We know that you're going to inspire and motivate people with your story around the world, and we're super excited to get your story on tape. So with your permission, we're going to start with where you were born, go all the way up to today, and then we want to talk about the 2 books that you wrote, right? And sort of the experience that you had with Jeff Weber, that kind of thing. So, where were you born?
I was born in Chicago, Illinois.
Okay.
And I was the oldest. I'm the oldest boy of 7 kids. We were Irish Catholic. And
did you grow up in Chicago?
Well, actually, about a week after I was born, we moved to a suburb of Chicago called Calumet City.
Okay.
Home of the Blues Brothers, Jake and
There you go, Calumet City. I love it. That's cool.
And we were there. We lived there until about the 6th grade, and then we moved to Gary, Indiana. We had all these kids, and we lived in a tiny 3-bedroom ranch style house. And my dad was working at a steel mill in Indiana, so we moved to Gary right at the kind of end of the 1960s. So it was a very tumultuous time. You're probably old enough to remember, I think, Richard Hatcher became the mayor of Gary, and he was the second prominent Black mayor in the United States. It happened to be Carl Stokes. I don't know if you remember, from Cleveland.
Yep.
So we lived there for 4 years, and it was tough. It was a very rich white community when we moved to Gary, and Mayor Hatcher became the mayor. People left the city. It was a really tough, lots of gangs, tough area to live in. So we moved back to Illinois, Lansing, Illinois, which is actually just south of Calumet City.
Yeah.
So I finished my high school there. Went to a high school called TF South, and then as I wrote in my first book, Reset, I had a really tough relationship with my father, and I won't go into too much. I explained it in the book. My dad had a tough time with his father. I think I met Grandpa Doherty only twice in my life, and I was probably under 6 years old.
Oh, wow.
So I had to get out of Dodge. We didn't have any money. We had all these kids. We didn't have any money to go to college. I was kind of fed up with going to school, and I wanted to get out and get on my own. So I went to the Air Force.
Oh, cool.
And you'll love this story. I was a guy who got straight D's in high school, Spanish and French.
Yeah.
I hated foreign languages. And I remember after I graduated from the 8th grade, my dad sat me down at the dinner table, and he picked out all my courses through high school from freshman year to senior. Yeah. And there was always foreign language in there. So he made me take them. I had to take them. I hated it. So I get into the Air Force. I tested very well. I get into the Air Force, and I qualify for the Defense Language Institute, which is the military's language school in Monterey, California, as a Russian linguist.
Of course you do.
So here I'm a guy. So, I remember when I went to the Air Force, I wanted to be either a police officer in the Air Force or a fireman. I wanted, and this is no shot against either one of those guys, but I wanted kind of a no-brainer job. I wanted something physical rather than mental.
Right.
And so here I am stationed in Monterey, California, studying Russian 8 hours a day and getting crushed. It was high school languages on steroids.
Right.
And so I was there for a whole year, and then got transferred to Texas. And I was fortunate. I got picked to be on to fly in a plane. And so ultimately, cutting through a lot of the schools, I wound up being stationed in Okinawa, and we would actually fly over Japan, and we fly off the eastern coast of Russia. We had tape recorded planes. We'd tape their air bases, come down and transcribe.
Wow.
So I had a top secret clearance, which sounds real sexy, but it wasn't. And so all these tapes was no James Bond. And so we had to transcribe tapes when we got back on the ground, and then they got transmitted to NSA. So I did that for 4 years, and then got out and went to Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois. I had buddies that I had graduated from high school that were getting ready to graduate from college, and I thought to myself, God, I'm not going to lose a job to somebody because I didn't have college.
Yeah.
So at 21, because I was only 17 when I went in the Air Force. My birthday's in September. I went to school, and I was getting crushed there. My life was a series of being crushed. I was crushed in the language school, and then having been out of formal school for 4 years, now going back to school and competing with kids basically right out of high school. So. Yeah. Anyways, I remember my junior year, kind of two specific things happened, or my sophomore year. I remember reading the Chicago Tribune, and I remember opening the classified ads because we didn't have the internet and anything like that back then. Right. So the first 12 pages, in the classified Sunday ads were like a mini book, and first 12 pages were accounting.
Yeah.
And so
it starts with an A.
Yeah. I wasn't that intelligent. So there were all these pages for accounting. And I thought I was there less to be educated, let's say, and in my mind, more to be trained to get a job.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to be a sociology major or an English major.
Right.
I was on my own. I had to figure it out.
And you weren't going to major in Russian.
Unfortunately, Bradley didn't have Russian as a language, but they actually gave me credits for it, which was kind of nice.
That's cool. That was nice of them.
Then the other thing was in the Chicago Tribune that year, they did 6 cities in the United States, and one of them was Portland, Oregon.
Yeah.
And coming from the Chicagoland area back in the 60s and 70s, it was heavy manufacturing, lots of pollution and all that kind of stuff. And Oregon had this aura of clean air, clean water. And so I decided my sophomore year that, and there was a sign in the article, there was a picture that said, "Come to Oregon, but don't move here." As soon as I saw that, well, they wanted people to visit, but they wanted to keep the pristine image of Oregon. They didn't want people to move there. So as soon as I saw that, Mike, as soon as I saw that, Mike, I decided I'm moving to Oregon.
Right.
So with that, I got my degree in accounting.
Since there was this red carpet invitation, right? Yeah.
Well, I was always one of these guys. If everybody went left, I went right. Like as an example, I was a good student in accounting, but everybody wanted to be a CPA.
Yeah.
So Mark Doherty decided, I'm not going to be a CPA. I'll show them.
Right. Here we go.
So anyways, I move out to Oregon and start my career as a controller, basically, of small businesses.
Wow. Cool. So we're in Oregon.
Go ahead.
We're in Oregon.
Oh, so I landed in Portland. It's the biggest city in the state, and I figured, and I literally, Mike, and I don't know that I would recommend this to anybody, but I literally borrowed $2,000 from my mother. I rented a U-Haul truck. I threw everything that I owned in it and drove out to Oregon. Mm-hmm. I didn't have a job. I got two suits for graduation. So I literally put my suits on and walked the main street of Portland downtown, handing out resumes.
Yeah.
anyways, eventually got a job with Georgia Pacific. I think the name has changed now. It's Blue Note or Blue Star or something like that.
Yeah.
So,
but Georgia Pacific was a paper company, weren't they? Like
yeah, they were stationed. Yeah, they were stationed in the Pacific Northwest, and then, ironically, I think a year before I actually started with them, they moved to Atlanta.
Yeah.
So I wound up becoming, yeah, oh yeah, yeah, and so I wound up becoming a timber accountant, and that was my beginning career in accounting.
Cool. So let me ask you just a couple of questions.
Sure.
Growing up, who was the most influential person to you?
It's funny because I've listened to your podcast. I had
you're ready for this question? Is that what you're saying?
Well, as I'm walking, I'm listening to your podcast and I'm thinking, God, who influenced me? Yeah. I had such a tumultuous relationship with my father. I can't say it was anybody in my initial family. My dad was a hard guy to love, and my mom was so overwhelmed with all these kids. I was good in sports, so it was probably coaches.
Yeah.
And I always, it's funny as I thought of this. I had a good friend, John Pelosa, whose mother just seemed to love me.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like I saw her all the time, but I still remember, and I put it in my book. We were Catholics. We went to the Catholic Church, and Mrs. Pelosa, I remember, because when we came into church, there was this mass of people. We had all these kids. And I remember Mrs. Pelosa turned around. She was like 5 or 6 pews ahead of us. She saw me and she winked. Oh. And here I am, 67 years old, and I still remember that moment of what I would call love.
Yeah.
And so because I was good in sports, I got a lot of kind of accolades from coaches primarily. Really influenced.
Cool. So growing up in Calumet City, we're going to leave Gary, Indiana out, but growing up in Calumet City, what was your favorite thing about growing up there?
I suppose it was kind of the freedom to be able to do what you want to do. And it was a very, every house was the same. It was a subdivision. Ironically, my dad's sister, my aunt, lived in the same subdivision. So it was almost like we had 2 houses. Because I was over, I had 2 cousins. I had a cousin my age, and then he had a brother. So it was like we had 2 families. And then my uncle coached my little league team. That was the first time I got exposure to organized sports. Yeah. And so in just the freedom, I remember we'd jump on our bikes and we would, Mike, we would ride our bikes probably 5 miles to the swimming pool. Like today, parents wouldn't even allow that to happen, And we would do that, and we would stop at the forest preserves and play tag. I mean, if we ever died, it would take them years to find us. We were just gone, Yeah. So I remember the freedom, and that was really the striking thing for me when we went to Gary, because it was so confrontational, and I had a lot of fear and anxiety just in my relationship with my dad. And then being in that tough environment was just, it was tough on me, really tough.
Kind of piling on.
Yeah, exactly. And, it was probably the beginning of my development of anxiety and fear that was just perpetuated by being in that kind of environment.
Yeah. Question for you. So in high school, we know what your not favorite subjects were. They were foreign languages. Did you have a favorite subject?
Yeah, I was always good in math. And I was in Gary, I was actually in accelerated math. I was there from 6th grade through my freshman year. Yeah. So then when we moved back to Lansing, I was actually most of the time I was always a year in math ahead of my school year. So in essence, when I was a sophomore, I was in junior classes. When I was a junior, I was senior classes. Right. But I was good in math, but like probably a lot of kids during that time period, I didn't like school. I was a really good athlete in Gary, and I couldn't seem to transfer that. I think coming into high school my sophomore year, I wasn't one of the guys.
Right.
And so I wound up not being able to transfer that into sports, and that created more issues between me and my dad because I was a good athlete, but I got cut. I was one of 3 white guys on an all-black team in Gary and was playing a starter. And then we moved to this white community, and I got cut from the team. And I just became disillusioned. I started to work, and that's kind of where I found my refuge. Go to school till about 12 or 1 o'clock, and then I would go work, and that's what I did.
I got you. So in the Air Force, what was your favorite thing about being in the Air Force?
My favorite thing about being in the Air Force was turning into an adult.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that makes sense to people, but as a matter of fact, I signed up in the Air Force in December of my senior year. Yeah. I knew I had to get out of the house.
Yeah.
I just had a tough relationship with my father, and I was dying to get on my own. It's funny, Mike, and I thought about this as I was thinking about the podcast today. And I don't consider myself unique in any way. I'm not super smart or anything, but I always had this plan or this kind of vision for myself that I just wasn't going to be a mediocre guy. Yeah. And I think one of the lessons I learned growing up in a large family was I saw the restrictions and the pain my family went through because my dad never made great money.
Yeah.
He had barely he graduated from high school, but it's probably the equivalent of a 3rd grade education today.
Yeah.
And he was a traffic manager, which is basically, I think, a white collar shipping and receiving guy.
Yeah.
And he tried to do college at night. But he had all these kids. And I think he was frustrated. And he saw, I think ultimately, as I've analyzed this and been in therapy for a million years, I think he wanted to be me, and he saw me not up to my potential.
Yeah.
And so the more he realized that, the more he pushed me, and the more being my personality, the more we grew apart.
Yeah. And that happens, when parents push their kids, the kids resent it, and it just creates this divide. It creates this wedge.
Yes.
And, there's a couple of ways to do this, right? There's pushing your kids, and then there's having standards, and there's requiring that they rise to those standards. Those are 2 distinctly different things. And I think it's important that people understand that. So,
right.
So anyway, so when you were in college, why did you pick the college that you picked?
That's a good question. I didn't want to go to a big college, and Bradley is a small liberal arts college. I went to another college, or I looked at 2 colleges, basically. I looked at this one in Quincy, Illinois, which is just a bit south of Peoria. Mm-hmm. And I love the college. They made me feel very welcome, but they couldn't offer me, they were very small. They couldn't offer me any money.
Yeah.
And at this point in time, I was 21, and I was off my folks' income taxes. Mm-hmm. So Bradley, because I was by myself, I basically didn't have any money.
Right.
Bradley was able to give me some money, and then I had the GI Bill, which everybody goes, ooh, but it was $300 a month, basically. It kind of, my rent was $160 a month, so it kind of paid for half my rent. Yeah. And then I got some grants from the state of Illinois. And again, I think maybe it was because of my age and because I was a veteran. I don't know, but I got that. And then when I got out of the Air Force, I had $5,000 that I had saved up, which is probably the equivalent of 50 today.
Yeah. No kidding.
So, and then I worked always in the summer, made enough money to pay my tuition. The tuition, I think, Mike, was $2,000 a semester, so $4,000 a year. Yeah. So it was very doable to make that tuition.
Sure.
It's astronomical now.
Yeah. So you moved to you moved to Oregon, pardon me, and
Right.
you go to work for Georgia Pacific. How long are you there?
I was only there for 2 years, and again, being who I am, I always felt like I wanted to make a difference. And I realized as my first formal job that I was just a small cog in a big wheel.
Yeah.
And I had met my wife, Sally, and she knew this gentleman that owned his own pallet business, wooden pallet.
Mm-hmm.
And we went out to their house just to meet him and his wife.
Mm-hmm.
And we struck up this conversation, and I think he was impressed with me.
Mm-hmm.
And the company was about $1 million at the time in revenue.
Mm-hmm.
And he was doing basically all of the office stuff. And he needed somebody to come in and kind of manage the office. So he asked me if I wanted to work there. And I saw it as an opportunity to kind of be part of something small.
Mm-hmm.
So I quit Georgia Pacific and went to work for him. And my first title was office manager. And I will tell you to this day, and I worked maybe we'll talk about it. I was the U.S. payroll manager for Nike for 4 years. Mm-hmm. They're based out of Beaverton, Oregon, which is right downtown there. Yeah. This job, the company's name is Billet Product. It's since sold. This company, I grew so much as a business person working for this company. Yeah. I mean, money is real in small companies. Mm-hmm. When I was at Nike, it's $1 billion company, right? And I had my little niche. I was the payroll manager, but my job was really to make sure that these people cranked out the paychecks correctly.
Right.
When I worked for a small company, I had to file the 940s and the 941s, the income taxes for payroll and all that stuff. All my payroll specialists at Nike, they didn't even deal with that. The tax department,
right,
3 buildings away did that. So I learned about receivables and payables. I had to make phone calls. People were calling me, where's the money?
Right.
It was accounting on steroids. I use that term steroids a lot because it was like it just hit me.
Yeah. And you have to handle everything.
You have to handle everything.
You went from Georgia Pacific that has a department for everything, right, to this tiny little thing where you're every department, literally.
Yeah, you're kind of HR and like a lot of the jobs that I had, I walked into my office and there's nobody there.
Yeah,
it's like, here's your office. This is your title.
Yeah,
have a nice day.
Right.
And that happened to almost every job I had. So I was there for 9 years, and then I left, and I wound up working for a company called Rogue Ales, or Oregon Brewing Company, and they made the microbrewery Rogue Ales in Newport, Oregon. Now, this is kind of interesting and kind of a connection to Nike. The owners of Rogue Ales were basically ex-Nike guys.
No, okay.
And one of the guy, the head shareholder, was a fellow named Bob Waddell. Mm-hmm. And Bob, if you know anything about the Nike story, Bob broke his back. Yes. Do you recognize the name?
Yeah. So he was one of the very first employees in the main office.
Yes.
I just finished Shoe Dog, the book.
Yes.
I just finished it like 2 months ago. Yeah, absolutely.
So Bob owned he was the lead shareholder. There were 5 guys. As a matter of fact, Rob Strasser, who's in the book and then was in the movie with Matt Damon. Rob Strasser was one of the owners, and I only met him one time. Wow. But I went to work for Rogue Ales, and Bob's in this wheelchair, and the same thing. I show up there, about $1 million, $1.5 million company. And I was stationed in Portland because Bob lived in Portland, and the brewery was in Newport, Oregon, which was 2 or 3 hours away.
Right.
And I go to they hire me. I go to the office, and they told me, they go, you got to put us up on the computer. And I knew this software at the time. And I remember it was this office, and they had big windows, and the sun is beating down on me. I'm looking out. There's nobody in the office other than me and Bob, and then this temporary gal that answered the phones. And I'm looking out the window thinking, how am I going to put this all together? I mean, there was nobody to ask.
Yeah.
And so it took me 9 months. I had to close the previous year's books, and then I had to start. So it took me about 9 months before I banged out my first P&L statement.
Yeah.
And by the time I left, so I was there for 5 years. That was another great education. But the things that I had learned at Bill of Products, I was able to transfer to there.
Yeah.
And actually, one of the reasons they wanted to hire me was they needed to get their books cleaned up. The idea was to sell the company.
Okay.
And we actually we hired an investment banker. We went through an audit, which was the first accounting audit I had ever been through, and surprisingly did pretty well with the limited resources I had to get the books cleaned up.
Yeah.
Anyways, Miller Brewing came and looked at us, and Miller was bought out by one of the tobacco companies. And so they came and looked at us, as I recall, in like October, November. And then in February or March, the whole cigarette cancer thing blew up. And Miller Brewing called us up. I'm sure corporate pulled in the reins and said, we're not spending any money till we get this figured out.
Right.
So they wound up pulling their interest in us. They didn't make an offer, but they pulled their interest. So anyways, for a variety of reasons, I decided to leave there, went to a small company for a while, and then ultimately, through a fluke, got hired at Nike as the U.S. payroll manager.
So tell us about the fluke.
So the fluke was, I was at a soccer game with my daughter, and my daughter was in the 4th grade, I think, and one of her teammates' mother was sitting next to me at the game, and I didn't know who she was, and she didn't know who I was. And we just started talking. And this was like in November, you play soccer typically in the fall. This was indoors, so it might have even been December. And she's talking to me, and I said, I have an accounting degree and blah, blah, blah. Didn't think much about it. I may or may not have known that she was I think I knew that she was at Nike, but I didn't know her role. And I think I made some comment to her about, geez, I had worked for small business all these years. And I thought, God, maybe it'd be fun to run with the big boys and see what Mark Doherty's really all, do I have what it takes to work with a big company?
Right.
So we have this conversation, and I don't hear from her for like 2 months. And then she calls me up on a Saturday at like 8 o'clock at night. And it was the second week in January. And I put this all together after I got interviewed. So anyway, she calls me up and she says, Mark, we have an opening in payroll. I'd like you to interview for the payroll manager. And by this time in my life, I was really riddled with anxiety and fear. And I remember my heart was like in my throat. And I was probably gagging, trying not to throw up. I was so, nervous, excited.
Right.
So anyways, I said, sure, I'll interview for this job. So I interviewed for the job, and she called me up and she says, and I was making $1,000 a week. So I was making 52 grand a year.
Wow.
And she called, and that's the most I had ever made to that point. And she calls me up. She says, okay, we'd like to hire you, and I'd like to start you at 65,000 a year. And I go, are you sure you want to start me that high? I was like, what an idiot.
Wow. Wow.
Like, can I pay you for a while? And if I don't,
we may need to send you back to negotiating school. Yeah. Wow.
So anyways,
I love that.
A while later, a few months later, and man, I'll tell you, because I told you I wouldn't cuss, I got my buns kicked at this.
Yeah.
Oh, we had so I was in charge of the payroll department and also all of the corporate personnel files.
Right.
So I had 6 people in the payroll department, and I had 5 temp people working the file room.
Yeah.
And it was a disaster.
Wow.
So what had happened and how I got the job was they had fired their previous payroll manager back in September,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't start till February.
Right.
And they went to a new payroll vendor,
Oh.
and they ran, and the night she called me, they ran their first payroll, and it was a disaster.
Oh my gosh.
This was a Saturday, so they ran payroll Friday. And I put this all together after.
Right.
They ran payroll on Friday. They must have worked the whole weekend to get all the things cleared up.
Yeah.
So anyway, she hired me, and then go ahead.
So all this came from going to your daughter's soccer game.
Soccer game. I'll tell you as we get on, it's funny how life's such a fluke. I mean, to become a Russian linguist, to go to college, to work at a place like Nike, they were all, and I do believe this sincerely, a lot of life is luck, being in the right place at the right time. But I also believe you got to have the skills and the vision to take on that risk.
Sure.
To go to Nike or to go to Rogue Ales
Mm-hmm.
and envision, how am I going to set up this whole thing?
Yeah, I agree with that.
If I didn't have those skills, I would have been out the door.
Yeah, but man, think about the networking that goes on at your daughter's soccer game.
Yeah, and you never even think about that.
Right. So at one point, you were in downtown Portland on the street handing out resumes.
Yes.
I remember this part of the story.
Yes. And nobody hired me.
Right. Right.
Those losers.
And then you end up, I mean, this is crazy. That is really cool. I love stories like that. Like I love, flukes, right? Like a guy gets on a plane and he meets a blonde sits next to him and they spend the rest of their life together, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah. I heard one of your podcasts with the fella that wanted to work at MTV and wound up sitting next to that gal.
So. 300 resumes he handed out to the employees as they walked in, right?
Yeah.
And then he ends up on the plane next to her. I mean, that was Jay. He's a great guy.
Yes.
And he was so much fun to interview because it was just like, well, okay, but listen to this, right? Or listen to what just happened, right? There's no way, right? I mean, it just, as you go through, and that's why we do this. That's why we do this podcast, because you find things out that happen in people's lives, and nobody could write that script. Like if you look back, there's no way, right? She's literally sitting next to him. They talk the entire. We hope you enjoyed another episode of the Mike Litton Experience. If you did, do us a favor, smash that subscribe button, tell your friends, family, and coworkers about our program, and wherever you get your podcasts, please leave us a rating. It helps us to connect with quality people just like you.
And that's a wrap. Another episode of the Mike Litton Experience in the books. Reach out to Mike on Instagram at Litton Realty. Want to meet with Mike? Check out Calendly.com/Rio760.